It was just another flight for Tim Reynolds. The kind of flight he'd taken many times before. A smooth, quick journey in first class, where everything was comfortable and easy. Tim liked flying first class. He liked the space. He liked the extra attention. Most of all, he liked the idea that he deserved it. After all, he worked hard, and that was enough to earn him a seat where he didn't have to worry about the little things, like crowded aisles or uncomfortable seats. On this particular day, though, Tim didn't think much about the flight. He didn't think it would be any different from the others. It was just a regular trip, another opportunity to relax, stretch out his legs, and enjoy a drink before landing in the city. He settled into his seat and adjusted the seat belt, glancing out the window as the plane began to taxi down the runway. But what Tim didn't know was that this would be a day he'd never forget. This flight, this seemingly ordinary trip, would end up changing everything for him in a way he couldn't possibly imagine. Sometimes, the most unexpected moments bring the biggest lessons, and Tim was about to learn that the hard way. Across the aisle, in the seat just a few rows in front of Tim, sat a giant. Literally. The man's broad shoulders and towering height were impossible to miss. Tim raised an eyebrow. The man was wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, his features mostly hidden beneath the dark lenses and the brim of his cap. He looked like just another celebrity, someone who might be rich or famous, but not someone Tim would pay much attention to. At first, Tim didn't think much of the man. People like him, Tim thought, were everywhere. They were the type to travel in luxury, just like he did. Tim didn't see why he should care about who was sitting next to him. But as the plane began to taxi, the realization slowly settled in that this man might not be like everyone else. There was something about his presence. Something that Tim couldn't put his finger on. The man didn't look like he was trying to hide or blend in. In fact, he seemed almost too relaxed for someone who might be in the public eye. He didn't care if people stared or whispered. He was just sitting there. Quiet. Confident. But Tim, being Tim, felt the need to do something about it. He had a sharp sense of humor, and when he saw someone he thought was a big shot, he couldn't resist the urge to make a joke. After all, why not have a little fun, right? Tim turned his gaze toward the man and couldn't help but let a small smile play across his lips. He knew he could think of something to say. Something funny. Something that would make the others around him laugh. He didn't think it would go any further than that. Just a little joke. A harmless way to pass the time. He leaned back in his seat and, in a voice that wasn't too loud but still enough for the people around him to hear, said, "Must be tough flying, coach, when you're so big, huh?" He laughed quietly to himself. He thought the joke was funny. But the man didn't respond. He didn't laugh. He didn't even look in Tim's direction. Tim raised an eyebrow. Had he not heard? Maybe the joke wasn't as good as he thought. But Tim wasn't the type to back down. If anything, he felt more determined to make the moment his. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, waiting for him to say something else. Something bolder. And so, he did. "Or do they make special seats for you?" Tim said, louder this time, as if trying to make the joke land. His words were sharp, and they hung in the air, clearly aimed at the man sitting across the aisle. The people around Tim shifted in their seats. A few even let out nervous chuckles, unsure if the man would react. But still, the giant in sunglasses and a baseball cap didn't say a word. Tim, now feeling the pressure to get a response, couldn't understand why the man wasn't engaging. Everyone else was laughing, or at least pretending to. The mood around the cabin was light. But the man, who Tim now realized was far too large to just be anyone, wasn't reacting at all. Tim's smile faded slightly as he glanced over at the man again. Was he ignoring him? The silence between them stretched for a moment, and the tension in the air thickened. Tim's smirk grew more nervous now, as he waited for some kind of response. But the man didn't budge. Tim sat back in his seat, his mind already moving on. Maybe the man just didn't have a sense of humor. Maybe he was too serious. Tim had made his point, after all. He'd thrown in a clever jab and made everyone around him chuckle. But something felt off. It was subtle. But as Tim looked around, he noticed something strange happening. The flight attendants, who had been going about their usual routines, started whispering among themselves as they passed by the man in sunglasses. They kept stealing glances at him, like they were trying to be discreet, but Tim caught their eyes. He saw the respect in their faces. He saw the way they adjusted their behavior. The passengers around Tim were no longer laughing. Their chatter had quieted down. Was this man important? Tim couldn't help but wonder. Was he someone famous? Maybe someone he should have recognized. But Tim didn't follow sports or the entertainment world closely. Famous people didn't impress him much. They were all the same, in his opinion rich, privileged, and full of themselves. But the way the staff reacted, the way people around him were acting, it made Tim uneasy. He tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, growing more intense with every passing moment. The thought nagged at him, just enough to distract him from the flight. The longer he sat there, the more he felt like something was about to happen. But what? A few minutes passed, and then the pilot's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to take a moment to introduce a special guest on this flight. Please join us in welcoming Shaquille O'Neal, NBA Hall of Famer and basketball legend, who is traveling with us today. Tim's eyes widened. The words were out of his mouth before he could stop them. Shaquille O'Neal, he muttered to himself, his face going pale. It hit him like a ton of bricks. The man he had been mocking, the giant in the sunglasses, was none other than one of the most famous basketball players in history. Shaquille O'Neal. Tim felt his stomach drop. The joke that had seemed so funny just moments before now felt like an anchor weighing him down. Shaquille O'Neal. How could Tim have been so blind? How could he have not recognized him? As the announcement ended, Tim looked around. The other passengers seemed to be taking it in stride. Some of them were even nodding at each other as if they had known all along. But for Tim, it was a revelation that hit him like a slap in the face. He had just insulted one of the biggest names in sports. And he had no idea what to do about it. He wanted to sink into his seat, disappear from the plane altogether. He could feel the eyes of everyone around him turning his way, some of them now eyeing him with curiosity, others with judgment. The flight attendants kept their distance now, though their eyes were fixed on him as they moved up and down the aisle. He could feel their disapproval, like a weight on his chest. They had known. They had known who the man was, and they had watched him make a fool of himself. Tim tried to focus on the window again, but his mind was racing. How had he not recognized Shaquille O'Neal? How had he not known? Tim didn't care much for basketball. To him, it was just a game that people got really excited about, but he didn't see what the big deal was. People ran up and down the court, chasing a ball, and then they threw it into a hoop. Big deal. He had his own interests, things like business, technology, and other stuff that seemed more important. But that didn't mean he didn't know who Shaquille O'Neal was. Of course, he had heard the name. He was a huge, famous basketball player. But to Tim, that didn't make him special. To Tim, Shaquille was just a big man with a few trophies, a couple of rings, and a lot of media attention. He didn't see why anyone should be impressed. After all, basketball was just a sport, and anyone could be good at something if they had the right talent. Tim was used to thinking of the world in terms of hard work and intellect. So, even though Shaquille was famous, he didn't think much of it. Fame didn't impress him. As the plane took off and started to cruise, Tim relaxed into his seat. He was comfortable now, a little too comfortable. He noticed Shaquille sitting across the aisle, looking as relaxed as he was. But Tim couldn't help it. He looked at Shaquille again and thought to himself, this guy's huge. Shaquille O'Neal was definitely bigger than anyone Tim had ever seen. His broad shoulders filled up most of the seat, and he looked like he could barely fit in the plane. His legs were long and thick, stretching out into the space next to him. The other passengers around him seemed to give him a little extra room, almost like they were nervous about sitting too close to him. But Shaquille didn't seem to care. He was just sitting there, with his sunglasses on, looking out the window like he was enjoying the flight. Tim couldn't resist. He had to make a joke. He didn't think it was anything big. It was just a little comment. He looked over at the giant sitting across the aisle and said with a small chuckle, "Hey, buddy, do they need to lower the ceiling for you?" Tim nudged the passenger sitting beside him, trying to get them to laugh. He was confident that the people around him would think it was funny. It was just a harmless joke. Shaquille was so big, after all. Everyone else had noticed it too. The man was so tall, he looked like he could touch the roof of the plane without even trying. So why not make a little fun of it? But Shaquille didn't respond. He didn't laugh. He didn't even look at Tim. Instead, he just sat there, looking out the window, as if he hadn't heard a word. Tim's smile faded for a second. Was the man ignoring him? Maybe he didn't hear the joke. Maybe he didn't understand. Tim looked around. The people sitting near him were watching, some of them with curious eyes. They waited for Shaquille to say something, for him to show some kind of reaction. But Shaquille stayed silent, his sunglasses still covering most of his face. His expression remained calm and unreadable. Tim, thinking the silence was an invitation, decided to press on. He wasn't going to back down. It was just a joke. He had made fun of people's heights before, and they laughed. He wasn't being rude. He was just having fun. So, with a little smirk on his face, he leaned forward and said, louder this time, "Must be tough flying, coach, when you're so big, huh? Or do they make special seats for you?" Tim was hoping this time Shaquille would laugh or at least give him some kind of response. After all, the whole plane could hear him now, and he was certain they were all waiting to see how Shaquille would react. But Shaquille didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge the comment. The silence stretched on, and the tension in the air grew thicker. People around Tim started to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some passengers looked down at their laps, avoiding eye contact. Others glanced over at Tim, unsure of what was going on. No one was laughing now. No one was smiling. Everyone seemed to sense that something was wrong, but no one said anything. Tim didn't notice. He was too focused on Shaquille. The whole situation felt awkward, but Tim didn't know why. It was just a joke, wasn't it? He told himself that maybe Shaquille just wasn't in the mood to joke around. Maybe he was tired. But the more he thought about it, the more Tim felt that he needed to make Shaquille respond. He couldn't just sit there while the silence grew heavier. He had to break it. So, he leaned forward again, this time even closer to the aisle, and tried to catch Shaquille's attention. "You know, I bet the airplane must feel really small for you. I mean, with your size, you probably don't fit in normal seats. Do they have special ones for guys like you?" As soon as the words left Tim's mouth, he felt a strange chill in the air. It wasn't just the coolness of the cabin. It was the uncomfortable feeling that had started to spread. The passengers around him were starting to look at him more closely now. They weren't amused. Tim looked around, trying to read their faces. But he couldn't tell what they were thinking. All he could feel was the heat creeping up his neck, a sense of unease that was starting to grow. Was he crossing a line? Was he pushing things too far? He didn't think so. He was just having a little fun. But Shaquille didn't react. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. It was like he wasn't even hearing Tim anymore. His face remained calm, his eyes fixed ahead. His body language was relaxed, like he was in no rush to respond to anything. He was just there, quiet, serene, almost like he was in his own world. And that's when it hit Tim: Shaquille wasn't going to say anything. He wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. And yet, in that very silence, something was happening. Something that Tim didn't see coming. The passengers around Tim grew more uncomfortable. A few of them exchanged glances, their eyes flicking between Tim and Shaquille. It was clear now that this wasn't just a simple joke. This was something bigger. Tim could feel the tension rising, and yet he was oblivious to it. He was so focused on Shaquille's lack of response that he didn't notice how everyone else was reacting. He leaned back in his seat, still thinking he had done nothing wrong. Maybe Shaquille just didn't like jokes about his height. Maybe he wasn't in the mood for humor. But Tim wasn't used to being ignored. He wasn't used to not getting the attention he thought he deserved. So he sat there, waiting for Shaquille to finally say something, to break the silence. But Shaquille didn't speak. The tension grew thicker. It was no longer just a joke. It was a moment that was slowly slipping out of Tim's control, and he didn't even realize it. As the flight continued, Tim couldn't shake off the strange feeling that had settled over him. At first, it was just a small discomfort, something he brushed off. But slowly, as the minutes passed, the tension in the air seemed to grow heavier. Tim glanced around, sensing that something was different. The flight attendants were moving up and down the aisles, but it wasn't the normal friendly chatter he was used to hearing. No, there was something off. He watched as a few of the attendants leaned toward each other, whispering in low voices. Tim couldn't catch every word, but he heard his name mentioned once or twice. His curiosity grew, but he didn't want to seem like he was eavesdropping, so he quickly turned his attention back to his magazine. But the whispers only seemed to grow louder. It was as if everyone around him knew something he didn't. Something important. And then, something truly odd happened. Tim heard a soft click from overhead, and then the calm voice of the pilot came through the intercom. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're pleased to have a very special guest aboard today. Shaquille O'Neal, a Hall of Famer, is joining us for this flight." Tim's heart stopped for a moment. Shaquille O'Neal? The very same Shaquille O'Neal, the giant who had been sitting across the aisle, the one Tim had been mocking just moments ago? Tim could barely believe what he had just heard. He looked around in shock, trying to process the information. This wasn't just any ordinary passenger. This was a legend, a man whose name was known all over the world. For the first time, Tim felt his stomach twist uncomfortably. The thoughts that had been swirling in his mind, his jokes, his comments, suddenly seemed like the worst idea he had ever had. He wanted to turn around, to apologize, but it was too late. The damage was done. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just any big guy. He was an icon, a Hall of Famer. He was the real deal. And Tim had mocked him without even knowing who he was. Tim's face turned pale. His hands, which had been holding the magazine just a moment ago, now rested nervously in his lap. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the quiet man across the aisle to be someone so famous, so important. Looking around, Tim saw the other passengers were all reacting in their own ways. Some were smiling knowingly, their eyes shining with recognition. They had all figured it out long before the pilot made the announcement. They had recognized Shaquille O'Neal right away, and now they were watching him with awe. A few people even waved at Shaquille, offering small smiles and greetings. Others gave him a respectful nod, as if they knew they were in the presence of greatness. Tim watched all of this, his guilt growing heavier with every passing second. The flight attendants, who had been whispering earlier, now seemed to be giving Shaquille extra attention. They approached him with wide smiles, offering drinks, snacks, and even a few extra comforts. It was clear they knew exactly who he was and were making sure he was treated with the utmost respect. Tim couldn't help but feel a deep sense of embarrassment. Why hadn't he recognized Shaquille earlier? How could he have been so blind? He had mocked a legend without even knowing it. And then, as if to make matters worse, one of the flight attendants walked over to Tim's row. She paused, glancing down at the floor, then up at Tim with an expression that was a mixture of concern and disapproval. She didn't say anything at first. She simply cleared her throat. Tim shifted uncomfortably in his seat, wondering if she was about to say something. Was she going to tell him to apologize? Was she going to lecture him for being rude? But the attendant simply nodded and then turned away, continuing down the aisle. Tim sat there, frozen, feeling his face heat up. For the rest of the flight, the tension never quite left. Tim tried to act normal, to pretend that everything was fine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the whole plane knew what had happened. Every time he looked around, he caught the eye of a passenger who seemed to know exactly what had gone down. They had all heard his jokes, his comments, and now they were all probably thinking the same thing, what a fool. It wasn't long before Tim began to feel completely out of place. The other passengers were treating Shaquille with the respect he deserved, and Tim felt small in comparison. He wished he could go back in time, to take back his careless words. But of course, he couldn't. The damage was done, and there was no undoing it. As the flight continued, Tim couldn't stop thinking about Shaquille. The man sat quietly, still as calm and composed as ever. He seemed unbothered by the attention he was receiving, and his presence only seemed to grow more powerful with each passing moment. Tim couldn't understand how someone so famous, so successful, could remain so quiet, so humble. It made him realize just how wrong he had been in his assumptions. Shaquille wasn't just a big man with trophies. He was a man who had earned his place in history, a man who had worked hard to get where he was. Tim, on the other hand, had been quick to judge, quick to make assumptions based on nothing but his own arrogance. By now, Tim had stopped trying to make small talk with the other passengers. He couldn't bring himself to look anyone in the eye. He knew they were all thinking about what had happened, and he didn't want to face their judgment. Every time he looked at Shaquille, he felt a deep sense of regret. He had mocked him, but now he realized that he should have been the one showing respect, not making jokes at his expense. As the flight neared its end, Tim's mind was racing. How could he fix this? Was there a way to make it right? He wanted to go up to Shaquille, to apologize for his comments, but the thought of doing so made him feel even more nervous. What if Shaquille didn't want to talk to him? What if he was angry? Tim tried to shake off his nerves, but he couldn't. He had no idea how to handle the situation. The longer he sat there, the more the tension built up inside him. He kept imagining what Shaquille must be thinking. Did he know that Tim had mocked him? Was he angry? Did he care at all? And then, just as Tim was about to start overthinking everything, something unexpected happened. Shaquille stood up. The plane was beginning to descend, and the flight attendants were asking passengers to buckle their seat belts. Tim glanced up, and there was Shaquille, standing tall in the aisle. He was making his way toward the front of the plane, his massive frame moving with surprising grace. As he passed by Tim, he looked down at him, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. Tim's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, everything around him seemed to fade away. It was just him and Shaquille. Tim couldn't speak. He didn't know what to say. All he could do was sit there, watching Shaquille walk past, his expression unreadable. Tim couldn't tell if he had even recognized him, but somehow, it didn't matter. Shaquille continued to the front of the plane, and Tim slumped in his seat. The moment had passed, and now, more than ever, Tim wished he could take back his words. He had no idea how he would make things right, but he knew that this flight, this day, would stay with him forever. He had learned a hard lesson: never judge someone based on appearances, and never make assumptions about people you don't know. When the plane finally began its descent, Tim could feel the unease building inside him. It had been a long flight, filled with awkward glances and uncomfortable silence. All around him, people were beginning to gather their things, preparing for the flight to end. But Tim wasn't focused on the luggage or the excitement of reaching their destination. His thoughts were a whirlwind of regret. Tim's mind kept replaying his actions over and over. His jokes. His mocking words. All the things he'd said about Shaquille, not knowing who he really was. His stomach churned as he thought about it. He had never felt so foolish in his life. He had been sitting right next to a basketball legend, someone who had done so much in his career, and all Tim had done was belittle him. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just a famous athlete, he was a giant in the world of sports, a man who had earned respect from millions, and yet Tim had treated him like some random person he could mock. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, and the seat belt signs blinked off. Passengers slowly began to unbuckle their seat belts and gather their things. Tim tried to blend in with the crowd, hoping to avoid any confrontation. He didn't want to face the embarrassment. But as he began to stand up and reach for his bag, a shadow fell over him. Tim froze. He looked up, and there, standing right in front of him, was Shaquille O'Neal. Tim had known this moment would come, but now that it was happening, he felt like he could barely breathe. Shaquille stood so tall, his massive frame almost blocking the aisle, his head brushing against the overhead compartment. It was impossible to ignore him. Tim felt small and insignificant, shrinking under the weight of Shaquille's presence. Shaquille wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting or making a scene. Instead, he took off his sunglasses slowly, revealing his eyes. There was no anger in his gaze, but there was something else, something intense. His eyes were calm, yet they held a deep understanding, like a man who had seen everything, someone who knew exactly how to handle any situation. "Tim," Shaquille said, his voice deep and steady. It was the kind of voice that made everyone listen, that commanded attention without even trying. "Do you know who I am?" Tim opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His throat had gone dry, and the words he had planned to say, words of apology, words of regret, seemed to get stuck in his chest. His heart raced, and he felt the color drain from his face. He could hardly believe it. The name Shaquille O'Neal had suddenly taken on so much weight, so much power. The man he had mocked without a second thought was the very same Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend. The person he had disrespected was someone whose name echoed in the halls of sports history, someone whose reputation had been built on hard work, talent, and success. Tim had no idea how to respond. His mind was a blur, and the regret was suffocating. He wanted to apologize, to say something, anything, to make things right, but the words refused to come. Shaquille smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't a smile of forgiveness or understanding. It was a smile that held a quiet warning. There was no kindness in it, just calm authority. "I could have embarrassed you right here, right now," Shaquille said, his tone low but clear. "I could have made a scene. I could have made you feel small, made you regret ever opening your mouth. But I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to let you think about what you said. I'm going to give you a moment to reflect. Because sometimes, the best lesson isn't taught by confrontation. It's taught by silence." Tim stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling like he was shrinking by the second. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but his words felt empty, meaningless. How could he explain what had happened? How could he explain that he hadn't known who Shaquille was? How could he explain that he had just been trying to make a joke? But in that moment, Tim knew that no explanation would make a difference. He had disrespected a man who didn't deserve it. He had judged Shaquille based on nothing more than his own arrogance, and now, standing face to face with him, Tim realized just how wrong he had been. Shaquille's gaze never wavered. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, calm and composed, like a mountain that couldn't be moved. His presence filled the space, and Tim felt so small in comparison. The silence between them grew longer, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes. Around them, the other passengers were watching closely. Some had stopped what they were doing, frozen in place, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding in front of them. Others had moved closer, trying to get a glimpse of the exchange. It was clear they had all heard what had happened during the flight, and now they were waiting, watching, to see how Tim would handle this moment. Tim's face flushed a deep shade of red, the heat creeping up his neck and spreading across his cheeks. His palms were sweaty, and he felt his heart pounding in his chest. Every pair of eyes in the cabin seemed to be focused on him now. The weight of their gaze felt heavy, like he was being judged by everyone in the room. And in a way, he was. He had made a fool of himself, and now he had to face the consequences. Shaquille's words lingered in the air, and Tim could feel the weight of them sinking into his soul. Don't think that because you're sitting in a fancy seat, you can disrespect people. You never know who you're talking to. The other passengers were quiet, listening closely to Shaquille's words. There was an air of respect in the way everyone held themselves. It wasn't just because Shaquille was a famous athlete, it was because his words held truth, and that truth was something everyone could understand. Tim didn't know how to respond. He couldn't argue with Shaquille's words. They were simple, but they cut straight to the heart of the matter. He had been wrong. He had made a mistake. And now, he had to live with the consequences of his actions. For a moment, it seemed like the whole world had stopped. No one spoke. No one moved. It was just Tim and Shaquille, two men standing face to face, locked in a moment of truth. Tim's hands trembled, and his throat felt tight, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. Shaquille finally broke the silence. He didn't say anything more, but the way he looked at Tim said everything that needed to be said. The calm intensity in his eyes told Tim that this moment wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about making Tim feel bad. It was about teaching a lesson that Tim would never forget. Without another word, Shaquille turned and walked toward the front of the plane. His massive frame seemed to glide through the aisles with ease, and as he moved, Tim couldn't help but feel a deep sense of awe. Shaquille didn't need to say anything more. He had made his point clear. He had shown Tim the power of silence, the power of restraint, and the power of respect. Tim stood there, still frozen in place, his mind racing. His heart was heavy with regret, but it was also filled with a new understanding. He had learned a valuable lesson today. A lesson he would never forget. And as Shaquille disappeared into the crowd of passengers, Tim knew that he would carry this moment with him for the rest of his life. Tim's legs felt heavy as he slowly moved down the narrow corridor of the plane, the sound of his footsteps echoing in his mind. Each step felt like it carried the weight of the entire flight, every glance from the other passengers still burning in his mind. They had all watched the moment unfold. They had all witnessed his humiliation. Tim had thought he could get away with making a joke, but now he realized how deeply he had gone wrong. As he moved toward the exit, he noticed the flight attendants still in the aisle, and their eyes met his briefly. There was no kindness in their gaze now. There was no warmth, no friendliness. Tim had lost the respect of these people, and the weight of that was heavier than anything he had felt in his life. He passed through the cabin door and into the terminal. His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything. He had been so arrogant before, so sure of himself. But now, all of that confidence felt like a farce. The reality of what he had done hit him with full force. There was no escaping it. Tim had disrespected Shaquille O'Neal. Not just any person, but a living legend. A man whose name carried weight, whose accomplishments were known around the world. He hadn't just mocked someone, he had mocked someone who had worked hard for every bit of his success. And that wasn't something Tim could easily walk away from. As Tim made his way through the airport, he caught glimpses of other passengers. Some of them looked at him with judgment. Others simply turned their backs, not wanting to acknowledge his presence. He felt completely isolated, as if the entire world had turned against him. But it wasn't just the other passengers that Tim felt he had lost. It was his own sense of dignity. His sense of self-respect had been shattered in front of him, and no matter how many times he told himself it was just a joke, deep down he knew it wasn't. He had crossed a line, and the consequences of that were still unfolding in his mind. He tried to shake it off, but it was impossible. The reality of what had happened was inescapable. His behavior had been wrong. He had thought he could mock someone based on their appearance, based on their size, based on what he assumed they were. But Shaquille had shown him that appearances were meaningless. That true strength wasn't found in size or wealth or fame, but in the way you treated others. And now, standing in the airport, Tim realized that he had learned a hard lesson. A lesson he wouldn't forget. As Tim left the terminal and walked toward his car, he replayed the events of the flight in his mind. He remembered Shaquille's calm voice, the way the basketball star had simply let his words hang in the air. Shaquille hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't tried to embarrass Tim in front of everyone. He had simply stated the truth. And in doing so, Shaquille had made Tim realize how small his jokes had been. The more Tim thought about it, the more he understood that Shaquille hadn't just been teaching him a lesson about respect. He had been teaching him about humility. About how easy it was to look down on someone and assume you knew them based on their appearance or status. But Shaquille had reminded him that there was always more to a person than what you saw on the surface. Tim knew he couldn't undo what he had done. He couldn't take back his words, no matter how hard he tried. But he could change how he acted moving forward. He could learn from this moment and grow into someone who understood the value of respect and kindness, not just to those who were famous, but to everyone he met. As Tim climbed into his car and started the engine, he glanced at the rearview mirror. His face was still flushed with embarrassment, but there was something else in his eyes now. Something different. Maybe it was the realization that he had the power to change. Maybe it was the understanding that true respect wasn't something that could be demanded, it had to be earned, and it had to be given freely. Shaquille's words still echoed in his mind, "You never know who you're talking to." Tim realized how true that was. He had been so quick to assume things about Shaquille, to mock him, to make him the subject of his joke. But in the end, it was Tim who had been the fool. He had been the one who had underestimated the power of respect. As Tim drove home, he thought about the people he encountered in his life. He thought about the small acts of kindness he had ignored, the ways he had treated people as if they were beneath him. He had spent so much time thinking he was better than others, believing that his position in life made him somehow superior. But Shaquille had shown him how wrong that was. Tim wasn't sure what he expected when he started making those jokes. He had probably thought they would make him look clever, or witty, or better than Shaquille. But now he saw how hollow those words had been. The truth was, they had only made him look petty and mean-spirited. And the worst part was, Tim hadn't even realized it until now. As he pulled into his driveway, Tim made a silent vow to himself. He would never let this lesson fade. He would never forget the way Shaquille had made him feel, the way the basketball star had taught him that respect was earned not by how much money you had or how big you were, but by how you treated others. He realized that he had been given a rare opportunity, a chance to learn and grow from his mistake. And while the moment had been uncomfortable and painful, it had also been one of the most important experiences of his life. The next day, Tim made a phone call to apologize to Shaquille. He wasn't sure if the basketball legend would take his call, but he felt it was the right thing to do. When Shaquille answered, Tim took a deep breath and spoke honestly. "I want to apologize for what I said on the plane," Tim said. "I was wrong, and I deeply regret my behavior. You didn't deserve that. I've learned a lot from this, and I just wanted to say I'm sorry." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Tim wasn't sure if Shaquille would even respond. But then, Shaquille's calm voice came through. "Apology accepted, Tim," he said. "I'm glad you learned something from it. Just remember, we all make mistakes, but what matters is what we do after. I hope you take this lesson and use it to be a better person." Tim's heart lifted. He didn't expect forgiveness, but hearing those words from Shaquille was a moment he would never forget. It felt like a weight had been lifted from his chest. As Tim hung up the phone, he smiled to himself. The journey wasn't over. But he had taken the first step toward becoming someone who treated others with the respect they deserved. And for the first time in a long time, Tim felt good about the person he was becoming. As Tim sat in his car, the sounds of the outside world seemed muffled, distant. His mind was a swirl of thoughts, each one like a wave crashing against the shore. He had never felt so conflicted, so uncomfortable with himself. The pride and arrogance he had once felt now seemed so empty, so pointless. He had thought he was better than others, but today, the truth had been laid bare. His actions on the plane had seemed so small at first, just a joke, a harmless comment. But now, after the way Shaquille had reacted, it felt like he had made the mistake of a lifetime. In that brief moment when Shaquille had turned to him and spoken, Tim had felt the weight of his words. The world around him had shifted. What had seemed like an innocent remark had transformed into something much larger, something much more significant than he could have imagined. Tim thought back to Shaquille's calm, controlled response. The way the basketball star had stood up, towering over him like a giant. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't tried to shame Tim in front of the other passengers. Instead, Shaquille had simply spoken the truth. And in doing so, he had shown Tim what real strength was. It wasn't about making others feel small. It wasn't about asserting dominance. True strength, Tim realized, came from showing kindness and respect to others, no matter their status or appearance. It had been a hard lesson, but it was one that Tim would never forget. He had been given the chance to see himself through the eyes of someone who had nothing to prove. Shaquille O'Neal didn't need to boast about his accomplishments. He didn't need to remind anyone of his greatness. His presence alone commanded respect. And that was something Tim had taken for granted. As Tim pulled into his driveway, he sat there for a few moments, staring at the steering wheel. He wasn't sure what to do next. Should he just move on and forget about the whole incident? Or should he take a moment to really reflect on what had happened? Tim knew that this was a turning point in his life. He could no longer continue down the same path of arrogance and disrespect. He had to change. After sitting in silence for what felt like an eternity, Tim finally made the decision. He would do something he had never done before. He would apologize. He would take responsibility for his actions and try to make amends. It wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't sure if Shaquille would even accept his apology. But it was the right thing to do. The next day, Tim picked up his phone and dialed the number. His hands were shaking, and his heart was pounding in his chest. He wasn't nervous about talking to Shaquille, he was nervous about admitting his mistake, about facing the reality of what he had done. When the phone rang, Tim felt a sense of dread wash over him. What if Shaquille didn't want to talk to him? What if the basketball star was still angry? Tim had no idea what to expect, but he had to try. He had to make it right. The phone rang for a few more seconds before Shaquille picked up. Tim took a deep breath before speaking. "Hello." Shaquille's voice was calm, as it always was. But there was something different about it this time. It was warm, open, and patient. "Hi, Shaquille," Tim said, his voice trembling. "This is Tim Reynolds. I don't know if you remember me, but I was on the plane with you yesterday." Shaquille paused for a moment, and Tim's heart raced. Had Shaquille forgotten? Or had he already made up his mind about Tim? "I remember you," Shaquille said slowly. "What's on your mind?" Tim felt a wave of relief. At least Shaquille wasn't brushing him off. This was his chance to make things right. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what I said on the plane," Tim began. "I was completely out of line. I made a joke, and it was wrong. I didn't know who you were, and I didn't respect you the way I should have. I want you to know that I regret it deeply, and I've learned a lot from the experience." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Tim wasn't sure if Shaquille would say anything. But then, Shaquille's voice came through, steady and kind. "Apology accepted, Tim," he said. "I'm glad you understand what you did. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after. You've taken responsibility for your actions, and that's important. Just remember, treating others with respect isn't about status or fame, it's about seeing people for who they really are." Tim nodded, even though Shaquille couldn't see him. He could feel the weight of those words sinking in. Shaquille had learned to rise above the small things in life. He hadn't let Tim's mockery define him, and that was what made Shaquille truly remarkable. He had shown Tim the power of grace under pressure. "I'll make sure to do better," Tim said, his voice steady now. "I want to learn from this. I don't want to make the same mistake again." "That's all anyone can do, Tim," Shaquille replied. "We all have our moments. But the important thing is how we move forward." Tim felt a sense of peace settle over him as they ended the call. He hadn't expected Shaquille to be so understanding. But now, more than ever, Tim felt like he had a chance to change. It wouldn't be easy. Old habits died hard, and Tim knew he would face challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. He realized that his behavior had been a reflection of his own insecurities. He had tried to lift himself up by putting others down. But Shaquille had shown him a better way. It wasn't about being bigger or more powerful. It was about being kind, about being humble, and about treating people with respect. Tim knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could build a better future. And that future started with the way he treated others. He wasn't sure what that would look like yet, but he was ready to find out. As he hung up the phone, Tim sat back in his chair, letting out a long breath. He had done something he had never done before. He had admitted his mistake, and he had learned from it. And that felt good. The journey wasn't over. But Tim knew that he was no longer the same person he had been the day before. He was ready to take responsibility for his actions, to be a better version of himself. And as for Shaquille O'Neal? Tim would never forget the lesson he had learned from the basketball legend. It was a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As Tim walked away from the terminal, his steps were slower than usual. The cool air outside hit his face, but he didn't even notice. His mind was still racing with the events of the last few hours. He thought about what Shaquille had said, about the way the legendary basketball player had carried himself with so much strength, grace, and calmness. Tim had never expected this experience to change him in such a profound way. When he had first sat on the plane, he was filled with a sense of entitlement. First class, the best seat, the best view. He had looked down at others, made jokes, and tried to feel superior. But now, walking through the airport and reflecting on it all, Tim realized how wrong he had been. Shaquille hadn't needed to say much. His silence, his calmness, had spoken louder than any words could. Shaquille had known something Tim hadn't. True strength comes from within. It wasn't about your physical size or your title. It wasn't about how many people knew your name or how much money you had. True strength came from kindness, patience, and understanding. Tim felt a rush of gratitude towards Shaquille, despite his own embarrassment. The basketball legend had chosen not to humiliate him, not to fight back with harsh words or anger. Instead, Shaquille had given Tim the greatest gift. He had shown him what it means to be humble and respectful. It struck Tim how often people think that those who are successful or famous are somehow different, distant, or even arrogant. People often assume that fame and success change a person, make them untouchable. But Shaquille's actions that day had proven the opposite. It wasn't fame that made Shaquille special, it was his ability to remain grounded, his ability to treat others with respect no matter who they were. Tim couldn't help but think about all the times in his life when he had treated people poorly. He had done it so many times, not even realizing the hurt he might have caused. The simple jokes, the casual mocking, all those moments when he thought he was better than someone else. He had done it without a second thought. But now, in the aftermath of the flight, he saw everything differently. Tim's mind wandered to his childhood. He had grown up in a neighborhood where everyone was always trying to one-up each other. It was a culture of constant comparison. If you didn't have the best car, the best house, or the most expensive clothes, you were seen as less. And Tim had adopted this mindset. He had spent so much of his life focused on outward appearances, on proving himself to others, that he had forgotten the most important thing: respecting others for who they truly were. It wasn't about looking down on people or trying to impress them. It was about seeing the value in everyone, no matter where they came from or what they had. People weren't just what they appeared to be on the outside. Everyone had a story, a life, a journey of their own. And Tim realized now that he had been blind to that. He had judged others based on their appearance or their status, never stopping to think about the richness of their inner lives. Shaquille had shown him that lesson. The man wasn't just a famous basketball player, he was a human being who had worked hard, faced challenges, and earned the respect of millions, not because he demanded it, but because he had lived a life full of integrity, humility, and respect for others. Tim now understood that being truly powerful wasn't about dominating others, it was about lifting them up. As Tim walked through the airport, he found himself looking at the people around him differently. The flight attendants, the passengers, the workers cleaning the floor, each one had their own story, their own worth. He no longer saw them as people he could make fun of or look down on. Instead, he saw them as equals, deserving of the same kindness and respect he hoped to receive. Tim couldn't change the past. He couldn't undo the moments when he had been rude or disrespectful. But he could change the future. He could start today, right here, right now, by treating everyone with the respect they deserved. It wouldn't be easy. He knew that. Old habits die hard. But Tim was committed to doing better. He wanted to be the kind of person who made others feel good about themselves, not the kind who put them down. He wanted to be the kind of person who inspired others, just like Shaquille had inspired him. That evening, as he sat in his living room, Tim reflected on his conversation with Shaquille. He thought about how powerful Shaquille's words had been. He had said it simply, "You never know who you're talking to." Those words echoed in Tim's mind, and he realized just how much they meant. It wasn't just about Shaquille, it was about everyone. You never knew who a person really was. You never knew what struggles they had faced, what dreams they carried, what wisdom they had. And because of that, Tim promised himself he would approach every person with an open heart, ready to learn, ready to respect, and ready to listen. In that moment, Tim made a promise to himself. He would never again judge someone by their appearance or their status. He would never again assume that he knew what someone was worth. He would be more patient, more kind, and more understanding. He would treat others as he hoped to be treated, with dignity and respect. The lessons Tim had learned from Shaquille O'Neal that day were lessons that would stay with him for the rest of his life. They were lessons that would guide him in every interaction, in every relationship, and in every decision he made moving forward. He realized that the key to true strength wasn't about being powerful or famous. It was about being kind, being humble, and treating others with respect no matter who they were. As Tim stood up to leave his house the next morning, he felt different. The world seemed a little brighter, a little more open. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for Shaquille's words but for the chance to change. He was no longer the person who sought to bring others down to lift himself up. He was someone who wanted to build others up, someone who recognized the power in humility, kindness, and respect. And as he stepped out into the world, Tim knew that he was ready to face whatever came next. He knew that there would be challenges ahead. He knew there would be times when it would be hard to keep his promise to be kind and humble. But he was ready to do the work. Because now, more than ever, Tim understood the value of respect. Tim smiled to himself, remembering Shaquille's calm, wise words, "You never know who you're really talking to." He knew now, more than ever, how true that was. And as he walked into the future, Tim was determined to show the world the best version of himself, the version that respected everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from. Because, in the end, it was respect that made all the difference. Tim had spent years living life by his own rules, a life where making others laugh or feeling superior was his way of gaining validation. But now, with the events of that flight replaying in his mind over and over, he realized how misplaced his previous notions of success and respect had been. In the weeks that followed, Tim found himself thinking back on Shaquille's words nearly every day. The quiet confidence with which Shaquille had spoken had left an impression deeper than Tim had anticipated. Shaquille hadn't needed to humiliate him to teach him a lesson. He hadn't needed to shout or even raise his voice. His actions had said it all. There was a part of Tim that was angry with himself. He felt foolish for not recognizing Shaquille sooner. But there was another part of him that was grateful for the chance to change. For the first time in a long time, Tim understood that true power didn't come from what you said or how loud you could speak. True power came from the ability to inspire, to lead by example, and to treat people with respect. As the days went by, Tim started to notice how different his interactions were with others. His colleagues at work, people in the grocery store, even strangers on the street, they all seemed different to him now. It wasn't that they had changed, it was that his perspective had shifted. The small gestures of kindness and respect that were once easy to overlook now seemed to shine brightly in his eyes. A smile from a stranger, a simple thank you from a cashier, a courteous nod from someone in the elevator, these things had never seemed so important before. But now, Tim understood that every person, no matter their role or status, deserved to be treated with kindness and dignity. One afternoon, Tim found himself in the same grocery store where he'd usually rush through his shopping, eager to get back to the comfort of his own space. But this time, he took a moment to talk to the cashier, an older woman who had always greeted him with a warm smile. He asked her about her day and listened when she spoke about her grandchildren. He didn't rush through the conversation or cut her off with his own thoughts, as he had often done in the past. He simply listened, and for the first time, he really paid attention to the humanity of the people around him. It was a small change, but it felt significant. As he walked to his car afterward, he realized something that made him smile. This was what Shaquille had taught him. This was the respect that didn't need to be demanded. It was the kind that was earned through the simplest acts of kindness and acknowledgement. But Tim didn't just stop at small changes. He began to think about how he could make a more lasting impact, how he could give back and show the world the lessons he had learned. He thought about the people in his life who had been kind to him, who had treated him with respect even when he hadn't deserved it. He thought about his parents, who had always emphasized the importance of humility and integrity. He thought about his friends, who had supported him through thick and thin. He realized that he had taken them for granted for too long, assuming that they would always be there without ever truly appreciating them. So, Tim made a decision. He was going to change the way he treated the people closest to him. He started with his family. He called his parents and thanked them for everything they had done for him. It wasn't a grand gesture, but the sincerity in his voice made all the difference. His mom seemed surprised, and his dad was quiet for a moment, probably processing the change in Tim. But then, his dad said something that made Tim's heart swell. "Son, I'm proud of you. It's good to hear you're learning these things now. Life has a way of teaching us lessons when we least expect it." Tim didn't realize how much he had needed to hear those words. He had always known his parents loved him, but hearing those words now when he was trying to change, to become a better person, meant more to him than he could have ever explained. It felt like the first step in healing some of the wounds he had carried for so long. A few weeks later, Tim found himself at a dinner with his closest friends. It was an ordinary evening, a casual hangout at his favorite restaurant, but Tim felt different. He was quieter than usual, more reflective. He looked around at his friends, the ones who had been with him through all of his highs and lows, and realized that he had never truly thanked them for their unwavering support. As they ate and laughed together, Tim decided to share a piece of his story with them. He talked about the flight, about Shaquille O'Neal, and about how everything had changed for him. He explained the lesson he had learned, the importance of respect, the realization that no one was less important than anyone else, regardless of their status or what they did for a living. His friends listened, some nodding, some with curious expressions on their faces. But at the end of his story, one of them, John, who had always been the quietest of the group, spoke up. "Tim," John said, "I've been noticing something different about you lately. You seem lighter, more open. And I think it's a good thing. You're not trying to impress anyone anymore. You're just being yourself." Tim smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. It wasn't about impressing people or proving his worth. It was about being authentic, about showing respect to others without expecting anything in return. As the night went on, Tim felt a shift within himself. He no longer needed to put on a show, to act like someone he wasn't, just to fit in or feel validated. He realized that true belonging came from being genuine, from showing respect and kindness, not from trying to be the loudest or the most important person in the room. That evening, as Tim drove home, he thought about all the changes that had taken place in his life. He thought about the person he used to be and the person he was becoming. He wasn't perfect, far from it. There were still moments when old habits crept in, when he felt the urge to joke or make light of a situation. But now, he knew better. Now, he understood the power of silence, of listening, of letting others speak and be heard. And in that moment, Tim made a silent vow to himself. He would keep going, keep growing, and keep learning. He would never forget the lesson that Shaquille had taught him. He would never forget how a simple act of kindness, a few words spoken with respect, could change someone's life. And most importantly, he would never forget that the people around him, no matter who they were, deserved the same kindness and respect he hoped to receive.